Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Since the outbreak of the U.S. trade war on China in 2017, the competition, if not a rivalry between the two countries, has grown and expanded into almost every front. This confrontational relationship was actually predicted years ago by my guest today, who is the author of the book Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Are China and the U.S. destined to collide? Is a confrontation between a rising power and a ruling power truly inevitable? Joining us to help us understand the intensifying global situation is Ms. Graham Allison, Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard Kennedy School. That's our topic. I'm Xu Jingdu. Welcome to the show, Professor Allison. Nearly 5 years ago, you were on this show to talk about the China-U.S. relationship, basically what would be called the Trump's trade war against China at that time. 5 years later, now we have a major war in the European continent, and climate change is not getting better. Global pandemic is still with us. Food crisis, energy problem. How do you see today's world? Do you have any change about your understanding of the world?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on the program 5 years later, and I remember our conversation, so I appreciate the opportunity. I think the book that I published now 5 years ago, just as Trump became president, and in the program that we did, my bottom line was that we should expect things to get worse before they get worse. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happened. So when a rapidly rising power, like Athens in classical Greece 2,500 years ago, or Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, or China in the past generation, seriously threatens to displace an established ruling power, this sets off such a discombobulation in both parties, both the rising power and the ruling power, that frequently they're vulnerable to accidents or incidents or even some otherwise easily managed event that nonetheless pulls them into a spiral that ultimately ends in a war, even a catastrophic war. So unfortunately, I think if Thucydides were watching today, he would say, well, it seems like the rising power and the ruling power are exactly on script, each of them almost competing to see which can better play its role. And unfortunately, probably sitting on the edge of his seat, anticipating the grandest collision of all times.
Mm-hmm. So we can draw the conclusion, compared to 5 years ago, we are sinking deeper into the trap.
Unfortunately.
But now, we have a major war in the European continent. I wonder, what do you make of this war between Russia, Ukraine, in the larger sense, between Russia and the West, the U.S., NATO, or the European countries over there? What is the end game? As I said, this war is beyond Russia and Ukraine. The U.S. has made it clear that, it's also their goal to weaken Russia in the battlefield. So with that, keeping in mind, obviously, the both sides seem to me can't afford to lose this war or appear to be losing, either from the Western point of view or from the Russian point of view. So that somehow will prolong the war in the sense, right?
A good point. And I think that, one thing is to be clear, the struggle between Ukraine in whatever amount of Ukraine it ends up with, and a Russia that will continue most likely to occupy some substantial part of Ukraine, whether just Crimea or just Crimea and the two provinces that it had before the war, or a little bit more. That struggle will continue, and there'll be low-level conflict, I would imagine, for a substantial number of years in the past. But you could imagine the hot conflict in which really, lots of bombs and bullets are falling every day, could come to some sort of a ceasefire with some degree of an armistice and maybe a partial agreement along a line of of contact, something that will look a little bit like India's and China's border line of contact, over which there's conflict from time to time, or North and South Korea, where you've got a parallel, but you don't never have had a peace treaty. And if you look at actually what's been going on in Ukraine since 2014, it's been a low-level conflict, but not a real war. So I'm hoping it could damp down. That would be hopeful. On the other hand, you could see this war. Mostly wars are long, not short. So if I do my just history, more often wars are counted in months and years than in days. And this is only day, I think, 62 or 63 of the war. So horrible as it is, it could last another year or two or beyond. Yeah.
Even longer, we will see the impact on this China-U.S. rivalry, obviously. Professor, if we mentioned about 5 years ago, the beginning of the trade war, and now there are growing voices in Washington that about lifting the tariffs on the Chinese goods imported from China in order to fight inflation in the United States. So are we going to see lifting of the tariffs on the Chinese imported Chinese goods?
I hope so. I think the tariffs were dumb when they were imposed. Understandably, China imposed reciprocal tariffs, but the net effect of this has been negative for the U.S. So these have not served U.S. interests, and the impact on Chinese economy I haven't analyzed carefully enough, but they've been modest in any case. So we would be better off without the sanctions. That's certainly right. So I think the hard part of the challenge, both for Joe Biden and for Xi Jinping, will be to figure out how, despite the rivalry, which is not possible to wish away. So some Chinese diplomats say we should just get over this competition thing and let's just talk about the cooperation we used to have in the old days. I say that's unrealistic. This rivalry is real because it really matters which economy is bigger, which country has the more advanced technologies, which one has the strongest military, who's more capable in the Taiwan Straits. All of those things matter because the two countries have different interests, just like countries have forever in history. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we live on a very small globe. So if the US and China should find themselves in a war, in a full-scale war, at the end of it, it's literally the case that the US could disappear from the map completely. And China, completely. No Chinese left, none. No Americans left, none. You think that's crazy.
And you mentioned about this, U.S. administration would use the word like a fierce competition. And then the U.S. is going to publish, I think in mid-May, this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So I'm thinking about, like what kind of rules, what kind of, basis for China and the U.S. to compete with each other, international rules or new rules. This Indo-Pacific Economic Framework obviously aims to win the support of regional countries in Asia Pacific, including India, for example, to counter the rise of China. How will that be impacting, or how will it impact this China-U.S. relationship here?
Well, again, a good question. And so I think it should be possible in most of the arenas, but very painfully, but nonetheless possible, for intelligent Chinese and intelligent Americans to figure out, okay, so here's the constraints on the competition. Here's the ways in which it could fall over into something that would be dangerous for both parties. Take, for example, what happens every day in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So both nations' naval forces operate, but they have a kind of a general understanding about incidents at sea and things that you're not supposed to do. Now then, each of them tests that from time to time, trying to push the other a little bit or push the other a little bit. I would say bad. Be cautious about that, because you could lead to a collision that could lead to an escalation that could be dangerous. But nonetheless, the proposition that there a competition, there's some constraints, there's some procedures for trying to deal with disputes, seems promising. And the example or the examples I draw from in history, if I go back to the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, over time, as leaders of both the U.S. and the Soviet Union came to understand the risks for both countries, if we should ever find ourselves in another confrontation like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were right on the edge of a nuclear war, the risks were so great that we developed a whole framework of constraints, some of them implicit, some of them explicit, some of them by treaties, like arms control treaties, where we would agree the Americans will not deploy a weapon that the Soviets find to be dangerous, and the Soviets won't deploy a weapon that the Americans find to be dangerous. So everything had to be reciprocal. Everything has to be negotiated. People always have to watch at the edge, because there's a temptation to think, well, if I could cheat a little bit, could I get away with it? And would it be to my advantage? So there has to be clarity enough about the rules and clarity enough about the verification. But that actually ended up constraining and allowing a competition to go forward. And ultimately, there is a competition between an American-style society in which Americans believe that free individuals are the centerpiece of the society, and government exists to let free individuals exercise their rights. And Xi Jinping's party believes, but a party-led society, in his words, the party leads the economy, the party leads the society, the party leads the government, the party leads everything. So that's his view. He thinks that society will perform better. Well, I would say that's a fair, as long as the two parties run within the, compete within the rules, that's a fair competition to run, and let that run for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, to see which of the two systems better delivers for citizens, what they want with their lives. So you could see, I have a Chinese friend who always says to me, well, you find it very strange how comfortable we are with a surveillance system that protects us from criminals and other things, where the government knows a lot about us and knows what's going on. And we find it very strange that you think that you're comfortable with people who go out and engage in mass murder every weekend at some supermarket or some shopping center or church or otherwise, and kill 10 or 15 people, shooting them with a gun. In China, that wouldn't happen. But it happens in the U.S. every week, whereas in the U.S., if the government knew as much about me as the Chinese government knows about its citizens, I would say, well, that makes me very uncomfortable. So there's two different systems. Let them compete, see how they work. Yeah.
I think a few months ago, probably, a senior U.S. defense official appearing in the Senate in the hearing, he talked about how important Taiwan is to U.S. He calls Taiwan as part of the strategic interests of the United States. And then people imagine that somehow he's indicating that Taiwan is so important to the United States that U.S. will not allow a reunification between the mainland and Taiwan, even it is peaceful. So is Washington changing its one China policy?
Good question. So certainly the Biden administration is clear, and President Biden himself personally is very clear, because he was part of this, when he was in the Senate, when this was originally developed, that the U.S. has a one China policy, that Beijing is the capital of China, and there's only one China. And there's also not one China and one Taiwan. So basically the Shanghai Communique and the subsequent statements by both governments, the Biden administration holds to completely. So that's point one. Point two, at the same time, American politics, especially as hostility towards China has grown, has a number of parties testing the water there. So Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State and who is a candidate to be a Republican nominee for president, has been saying, well, it's time for the U.S. to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now, I offered my view about that, which I have to Mike, because I know him from when he was a Harvard Law student for a long time ago, that's what he's proposing is crazy. Okay, that's my view. I think that the surest path to a war between the U.S. and China would be for the U.S. and or Taiwan or China, any one of the parties, to basically destroy the framework that was created 50 years ago that has actually provided the most successful period for well-being for people and parties on both sides of the straits and in the U.S. of any of the 50 years, in the previous history. So I think what we have in the one China policy and the principles around it that are reflected in the Shanghai Communique and the subsequent has been a great achievement for China and for the U.S. and for Taiwan. And we should find a way to refresh it and reinforce it, but certainly not to depart from it. But I think that the forces at work in all three societies are making that more challenging. So Taiwan, obviously, the society is changing in important ways, and certainly have changed dramatically since 50 years ago. China, which was a poor, weak country 50 years ago, is now a wealthy, strong country. So that world has changed dramatically. And the U.S. position of unchallenged predominance in Asia 50 years ago is now clearly contested. So the real world has changed for all three parties. I still think in the new world, the Shanghai Communique looks very good to me, even though it needs to be, refreshed a bit. But you certainly have an impulse in the U.S. government, in the Republican Party now, to try to change that. And I think that's in my view, a big mistake, but that's a description of the politics we have here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor, when dealing with this common threat to the human being, for example, like climate change, like a pandemic, we are seeing a bit of cooperation, but not too much on climate change, but not on pandemic. And not enough, far from being enough. So looking into the future, do you think China and the U.S. can or will cooperate, more closely in terms of fighting climate change or we don't know, like another pandemic, for example?
Yes, but it's now back during the Obama administration, shortly after he became president. Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he said he thought that we needed to find what a new form of great power relations. I may not have the translation exactly right. It was sometimes called a new form of major power relations or something. But in any case, and unfortunately, the Obama administration did not embrace this idea. I wrote a piece about it immediately, and I said, this sounds like a great idea to me, okay, to recognize that the US and China are great powers, that they are going to be rivals, but that war between them would be catastrophic for both of them. So we have to find a new form of how we can manage this relationship. And one of the very interesting things about Xi Jinping's proposal at the time was he didn't fill out all the details. He just sort of put up the idea, and it was almost like an invitation to, well, then let's see what the blue, you offer your version of the blueprint, I'll offer mine. We go back and forth and develop it. So it wasn't like only do it my way. Here, I'm just saying, basically, we need a big new idea. It needs to not end up in a war. Now, how are we going to do that? Okay. So I would say that's a good idea. And I think that it would be possible, maybe in the politics now, especially in Washington, it would be difficult. But if you start with, well, here is a climate. We all know we live in this small enclosed climate. We all know that if we just emit greenhouse gases the way we're doing today, our children or grandchildren are going to have their lives severely imperiled. So can we find a way for our own survival to cooperate, even if we don't agree on most things? I would say if we were smart, we could do that. Now, what about pandemics? Pandemics don't have a passport. They don't observe borders. So if something emerges as a new virus, pretty soon it's everybody's problem. So would it be possible and be feasible to imagine that we would have a better system for dealing with it? For example, when actually at the beginning of the story, when the Chinese put up the genomic code of the virus, that speeded the process of development of vaccines. Unfortunately, not enough cooperation with respect to the vaccines, and I would still say that's an opportunity for China. It turned out that the biotech industry in the U.S. was more innovative at the time, came up with a better vaccine earlier. It should be available for everybody. I tried to propose that the U.S. just try to make available, vaccinating the whole world. That would be a good joint project for Chinese and Americans to do. But in any case, will there be more? Will we have more opportunities with pathogens? For sure, there'll be another virus for sure, another one and another one. So how are we going to deal with that going forward? War is the one that interests and worries me the most. So again, it seems so crazy, but the thing about what's happening that we can see every day in Ukraine, it is pretty crazy to see people crushed and killed and the tragedy, the lives that occurs. But if it should turn out to be, for whatever reason, something went wrong over Taiwan, and the Taiwanese are now moving towards independence, and China takes military action to prevent that from happening, and the U.S. becomes engaged to try to defend Taiwan, and a war between the parties begin. I played that war game many times in the beginning, and at the end of it, basically, it's a disaster for everybody. So the right answer to that is no. We should not start down this path. We should find a way not. So, and if the desire for survival is one of the most reliable human imperatives. So if we're smart enough to see our survival requires us doing difficult things together, then I think Chinese government is pretty smart government. U.S. government can be pretty smart sometimes. That's not beyond the mind of human beings if they would stretch. Mm-hmm. Now, if they just settle for business as usual, if it's just normal, just be complacent, then I would say we should expect history as usual. And Thucydides told us about that. But our objective is to be beyond normal, to do better. Yeah.
To do better. Well said. Professor, the last question. We know that there's unanimity basically on the China policy inside the Washington Beltway, let's say, to be now is more hostility probably. And so with this upcoming election, the midterm and also 2024, Trump or someone like Trump, could come back to the White House. How will that impact the China-U.S. relationship?
Oh my goodness, good question. So I would say that's like a nightmare, but cannot be dismissed. Cannot be dismissed. So it's possible that a Trump or a Trump-like candidate will succeed in getting the nomination, and it's possible that they will win the White House in 2024. I would bet not, but of course I'm a Democrat, so probably I'm a bit prejudiced. But I would say for looking at the U.S.-China relationship, this is something that obviously anybody has to take into account. Now, what were relationships like under Trump with China, and what would they be like under a second Trump or a Trump-like person going forward? Trump was actually interesting in this regard. He, on the one hand, he accused China in the campaign of every possible crime, raping the U.S., robbing us, stealing, whatever. But then he was quite willing and ready to do business with China, eager to do business with China. And so I think I think many Chinese who dealt with him found him kind of hard to make out, because on the one hand, he would behave erratically this way, but on the other hand, maybe you could make a deal with him, on the other hand. So I think that the Chinese government found him frustrating, as did many other people who tried to deal with him. So I would suspect that in making choices about dealing with the U.S., the Chinese government will be calculating and watching what's the likelihood that I'm going to be dealing with Biden and a Biden-like administration going forward, and then what are the risks that I might end up with a Trump or a Trump-like, candidate going forward. That makes it difficult for, having a stable base for a long-term relationship. I think on the other hand, if the issues are, well, how about nuclear war? Does anybody have a view that's a good idea? The answer is no. Okay. Well, what about an unlivable biosphere? What about that? Well, except for a few strange people, the answer is no. What about pandemics? Well, no. What about actually trade that enriches both of us? Well, we like Chinese goods, okay? So no. So I think it may be possible to build some strands of a stable relationship, even in a context in which there's uncertainties about changes at the political level.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Professor Allison. Thank you for your time and insight. With that, we come to the end of today's show. I'm Xin Duo. You can find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.